Hello, everyone. My name is Gary Baumgarten, but I expect you already know that, and I welcome you to this discussion on Facebook Live, paltalk.com, and on YouTube. Well, was it President H.W. Bush who said it's the economy, stupid? Something like that, he said. And when it comes to elections, and in his case, re-elections, the economy shot him in the foot after making that pronouncement. And I know we're discussing all kinds of other things when it comes to this election, most notably the coronavirus, how that doesn't help the president, the turmoil on our streets, how that doesn't help Vice President Biden. But really, when it comes right down to it, in a lot of people's minds, their pocketbook is what matters. So I have asked our good friend, Peter C. Earle, an economist and writer who's with the American Institute for Economic Research, to join us again to sort this all out. Peter, welcome back to our discussion on Facebook Live, paltalk.com, and on YouTube.
Thanks for having me, Gary. I'm glad to be back.
Glad to have you. So there were some interesting and unexpected numbers just not too very long ago. One would have expected, given the shutdown of the economy, that they would be bad. But the GDP numbers were good. The unemployment numbers were not as bad as they had anticipated. And right now, the stock market seems to be reacting favorably to the stimulus checks that have gone out so far.
Right. So there's a lot to unpack there. But I'll start out by saying that the United States entered, at least according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, the agency that has the job of dating economic expansions and recessions, the United States entered a recession, according to them, in February of this year. So basically, that marked the end of a 128-month expansion, which was the longest on record. And since then, we've had the outbreak of the coronavirus and a number of policy initiatives, which sort of led to what I would describe as a policy-induced economic coma, or at least maybe an artificial recession or even depression. We could talk about that. The first quarter of 2020, we saw a decline of GDP of about 5%, which was terrible. And then the second quarter was a decline in GDP of just under 33%, which is the fifth largest going back a century. And it's just, I mean, it's a staggering number, but what's really staggering about that is that the day we got that GDP number, it didn't appear on the landing page of any of the major news sources because it was expected. People generally expected that if you shut the economy down, you're going to have a terrible GDP number. So right now, year over year, the economy is down. The U.S. economy has contracted by just under 10%. That's 9.5% roughly. Now, to put that in perspective, a decline of 10% is, by one definition, a depression. Now, the National Bureau of Economic Research doesn't actually date depressions, but there's a few what I would call folk definitions, or definitions that economists use. One of them is a recession that lasts 2 years. Another is a 10% decline, a 10% or greater decline in GDP. Now, nobody was able to tell me, and looking in history books, I couldn't tell whether that's quarter to quarter or annualized. Either way, we either vastly exceeded on a quarter to quarter basis, or we're close to it on an annual basis. On a year-over-year basis, but it's an interesting time. But it's even more interesting that it has happened, and for the most part, it was met with something of a shrug.
So what's interesting, a couple things. You mentioned that they recognized a recession even before the coronavirus. That's another thing that makes me wonder. And I've had this argument with people over the last several elections. Bill Clinton was given great credit for the good economy. This president was given great credit for the good economy until now. And maybe he gets a pass in the minds of a lot of people because of the coronavirus, but you say that the economy started tanking before the pandemic. But don't we put too much stock, pardon the pun here, in the president when we analyze the economy? I think, yes, sometimes policies announced by the White House affect the global economy. I'm not saying that they don't, but overall, I argue with those who are more learned than me in these areas when they say that it's in the hands of the president of the United States.
Well, you definitely picked the right side of that argument, because the president the president, to a lesser extent, the cabinet, the administration, even Congress, um, they get a lot of credit and they receive a lot of sort of blowback when the economy doesn't do what people would like it to do. But the fact is, a lot of what happens has to do with the Federal Reserve. It's actually monetary policy that drives a lot of what happens in the economy, and in particular, more even than the economy, more specifically in financial markets. There's an argument that can be made. It's an argument that I would make that what we've seen in the stock market is little more than just really high-powered money entering. It's a combination of things, right? So first, of course, nothing is univariate. So of course, the Federal Reserve, part of its stimulus packages, part of its attempt to sort of put out the fires that were going on early on in this and keep credit markets from freezing up. They put a lot of new programs into place. Many of them were programs that they had put in place during the 2008 crisis, and they just sort of dusted them off. In some cases, they expanded them, but it's a lot of the same stuff, to be honest. But what happened was, when that happened, that began pushing up on markets. And in particular, hopes for a quick recovery led people to start putting their money into the stock markets. And then what happened is, a really interesting thing happened, and this is not a major cause, but it's a cause that's worth mentioning, is that a lot of people at home started trading on their online brokerage accounts. And on top of that, there's no sports, so there's no fantasy sports, so there's no online wagering. And so all of a sudden you have weird things happening in the markets, like bankrupt company stocks going up, things like that. So there's been there's a monetary policy aspect to this move in the markets, but there's also very much a sort of a behavioral aspect to it too. In particular, momentum trading. As things go up, eventually they sort of develop a life of their own.
What's interesting, because Jim Cramer at CNBC, who one might argue is more wrong than he's right, but a lot of people think that he's the big financial guru, says, now he's not talking about the Dow, he says, with the S&P at new highs, the actual economy is in precarious shape. And I think that speaks to what you just said, is that, of course, the Dow Jones, the S&P, they are indicators, but they're not the beat all and end all. There's a lot to the economy that are not reflected by the blue chip stocks.
Sure. I mean, a couple of things just off the top of my head. One is that stock markets are forward looking. They're looking at the prospects for earnings sometimes a year or more ahead, where we live in the economy today. The other thing is that all of these economic indices, or rather all of these stock market indices, the Dow Jones, we're talking about 30 stocks. The S&P 500, we're talking about, 500 stocks, whatever it is. Sometimes it's less than that, depending upon what's going on in terms of corporate actions and all that. But this country is made up of hundreds of thousands of businesses, and mostly small businesses, which are really critical. So I don't think the stock market is reflecting the broad economy, and I don't even know if it's reflecting the prospects for those large companies that are in those indices. But there's a huge disconnect between what happens in financial markets and what's happening in the brick and mortar, or even virtual, if you want to look at it that way, economy. There's a huge separation between the two.
The guest is Peter C. Earle. He's an economist with the American Institute for Economic Research. I almost said of, I don't want to get it wrong. For Economic Research. John Barry, the author of The Great Influenza, I don't know if you saw his op-ed in yesterday's New York Times, but he says that if we don't get the virus under control, the economic devastation will get worse. What are our prospects with regard to that, given the fact that we see no end in sight, at least yet, when it comes to the pandemic?
So in my view, what's sort of been put out there all along, since maybe late February, early March, is something of a false dichotomy. There seems to be this view that we can either have a vibrant economy or public health, but not both. I think a lot of the problem, and one of the things that's really concerned me the most in seeing this latest raft of economic numbers are not even so much GDP and unemployment, but it's business confidence. Business confidence is shaken. And one of the reasons why is because there's really no faith in the reliability or the consistency of policy. So a few things just come to mind. And one of them is that businesses are not going to invest in capital expenditures. They're not going to invest in expansion if they're not sure whether the rug will be pulled out from them already. And we have on top of the coronavirus, some apparent, second waves, if you will, in certain places, and the policy that's coming from that. But now we also have high levels of civil unrest. I'm sure a lot of people are concerned about this election one way or the other. So last I saw, business owners that were polled in one of the small business confidence polls basically said they were concerned about the next 3 to 6 months. Now, the longer the businesses stay closed for, the more some of them will be closed forever. Some of them will not recover. Small businesses are known for not keeping a lot of cash on hand. So it's a very dangerous thing that we have right now. The recovery is underway, but it seems to be a little bit shaken. And that's my biggest concern would be inconsistent policy and also blanket policies, by which I mean, I'm in the state of Massachusetts right now. I'm in Berkshire County, which is far west. We have something like 40 or less cases, but all the regulations and all the COVID policies are being made with respect to what's happening in Eastern Massachusetts and Boston. So we have the same restrictions, while in fact the risk of infection and actually just the state of our public health here is much, much better. So, more consistent policy and maybe promulgating policies on a local level instead of states down or federally, because certainly different areas have their own concerns. They also know their communities better. They know what the businesses are. That to me would be one way of making sure that this recovery, which now looks more like a U than a V, that at least it's a shallow V and not a, it looks more like a U than a V now, I should say. That to me would go more towards creating a shallow U rather than a long protracted one.
Obviously, this is probably the most challenging thing to hit businesses in the history of commerce during our lifetime.
Oh, sure.
But I don't want to be mean-spirited about this, but isn't this a little bit like survival of the fittest? We have some large companies that are closing down, probably permanently. And then you have, for example, today, Target reported that they shifted to online sales. They're not closing their brick and mortar stores, but their profits are better than ever right now. And then you look at these poor restaurants that are struggling.
Yeah.
And a lot of this has to do with local regulations and with infrastructure around the restaurants. Some cannot do this, but there are restaurants that are doing very well with outdoor seating. It's not wintertime, so you can do this. And also with carryout, there's some restaurants that are doing a bang up business. One guy was interviewed, I didn't interview him, but one guy was interviewed a couple of days ago, and he said, well, yeah, we're not pushing people through like we did before, but we have converted to this carryout and delivery. And that means I don't need the wait staff. This is bad news, obviously, for the wait staff, but for the business,
Right.
I don't have that personnel overhead that I had before, and I'm doing just fine.
So it's very situation dependent. Certainly I could see that some businesses that had a takeout, like we'll deal with restaurants because that's a really good example. So some of those restaurants had a takeout capacity, maybe they had order or delivery capacity. Many of those are doing well, and in some cases better after the lockdowns than others. But there's a reason why I use the term artificial recession or artificial depression before, because this caught a lot of people by surprise. And I don't think a lot of business owners ever thought that a decree could come down whereby you just have to shut down, with no end in sight and no parameters on reopening. And I guess to some extent, there are people who would say, well, a business that has a lot more cash on hand was obviously thinking ahead and they're going to outlast this thing, whereas some that didn't have as much cash on hand are going to go out of business. But a lot of small businesses plow their earnings, with the exception of a small income for the owners or whatever to keep the lights on. A lot of the small businesses plow their earnings back into the business. And small business is really the engine of growth and employment in the U.S. economy. So I wouldn't take that Darwinian a view, especially because this is not like a power outage or like a natural disaster or something. This is an artificially imposed, to use the term I used before, economic coma, and people were sort of caught in the act. They were sort of frozen in time. And if any of them had had the chance, I'm sure many of them would have had more cash socked away or whatever.
the longer this continues, I think the worse it is for the president in two respects. One, people are getting sick, people are dying. Thank God the percentage of those who are dying has decreased. I don't know why. I'm not an epidemiologist, and neither are you, but it has. But still, if you have a family member or friend who's very sick from the coronavirus, that reflects badly on a president who initially called this a hoax. But on the other hand, he also, I think, struggles because he wants to get the economy going. He's anxious to, and maybe for the economy and for the American people, maybe for himself politically. But if this continues to drag and the economy does not spark between now and November, my analysis is that that's harmful to the president.
No doubt about it. Two things. First, it's harmful to the president, but it's also harmful to public faith in governments and regulatory institutions and all that. And it probably shouldn't be because, I mean, let's face it, we know that governments tend to screw up a lot of what they try to do anyway, and we haven't seen anything like this in a long time. And also, the proportions of this, in many ways, have been this has been blown out of proportion. Again, one-size-fits-all strategies are one of the Achilles heels of policymaking. But yeah, I mean, like I said, if it weren't enough that there's open-ended lockdowns in some places re-lockdowns, and just concern about the broader economy and about the ability not only of businesses to stay open, but of consumers and employees to come back to work. There's also the prospect of an election, which already has rumbles of contention in terms of the postal service and all that, and civil unrest if it goes one way or the other. Who knows? So yeah, there's we say in financial markets that markets climb a wall of worry. I've never seen a wall this high before, and I've been following this pretty regularly since the early 1990s.
I don't think the civil unrest, and I think I mentioned this a little earlier, does Vice President Biden any good. It probably actually helps the president a little bit. Sure. Now, I just want to counter what I just said about how this is difficult economically and medically for the president's reelection. The Wall Street Journal, which is conservative and you would expect that it would be supportive in their editorial policy to the president, they wrote on their op-ed or on their editorial page, the Democratic convention case against President Trump boils down to COVID in character, and the polls suggest it's working. But the bigger issue next year will be reviving the economy from the shutdown recession. And on that score, the Democrats are mostly quiet. Perhaps that's because Joe Biden is promising to repeat the same policy mix that produced the slowest recovery in modern times during the Obama years. The record is worth examining. Is that a fair assessment of, do you think, of the Obama-Biden economic policies?
Somewhat, yeah. I mean, I think that the only thing that would really help a recovery right now is something which neither side, neither a Trump administration reelected or a new Biden-Harris administration would do, which is something along the lines of what I would call a regulatory and maybe tax jubilee, which is for a period of 30 or 60 or 90 days, encourage states, encourage counties, encourage municipalities to basically remove most of the fetters that really prohibit doing business. I'm not talking about removing, say, environmental regulations and all that, but I mean, a brief relaxation of maybe certain laws about how long firms can operate for, maybe relaxation of temporary relaxation of minimum wage, all those sorts of things, everything we can do to sort of remove the barriers to businesses getting back up and running and engaging customers and engaging clients again, getting the term structure production working again, all that sort of thing. And I say that because I don't see any recommendation of that, despite Trump said some things like that early in his presidency. We haven't heard a lot about it, but if either side were to come out and say that, I think they would gain a pretty positive view in terms of the electorate, and they would also, more importantly, actually have a chance of getting the recovery of the economy underway in a speedy fashion.
Well, as you pointed out earlier, Peter Earle, the government, whoever the government may be, is not particularly known for efficiency and competency. And I will just close with something anecdotal that I recognized on Saturday. A friend of mine and I went out to dinner. And this was the first time outside of my family I had sat down at a restaurant with another individual in 4 months. And it was kind of interesting because we didn't know how to even greet one another. Normally we'd hug one another. You can't do that. But it was very nice. It was a patio in Manhattan at the back of the restaurant. So we were outdoors. There was social distancing. It was very lovely. So after we had our dinner, she suggested that we go elsewhere for an after dinner drink. I said, absolutely.
Sure.
We walked up the street to another restaurant and we said, could we sit down and have a drink? And they said, no, because under the regulations, if we serve you a drink, we have to serve you food. And if we don't serve you a meal with that drink, we could be shut down by the city. Okay, fine. We literally walked a half a block away to a bar which doesn't serve food, and they had tables outside, and we were able to order a drink at the bar without ordering food. So you wonder about these regulations and their effect on businesses. To me, it was like kind of weird and frustrating and all that. But I felt bad for this guy where she knows the owner and she wanted to throw some money towards this guy in her neighborhood, and he couldn't accept our money. I mean, come on. You have to be a little more prudent and fair in your regulations. Otherwise, you're going to kill businesses.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Consistency, predictability, that's key to business confidence, which is right now looks a little shaky.
Peter C. Earle, you're always a fountain of information, and I appreciate you agreeing to come back on with us. And I wish you the best of luck. Please stay safe. And folks, as I always say at the end of our discussions, peace out.
Thanks for having me.